Chris Paulson from McPherson, member of the Flatland Tees, one of the local clubs. Just wanted to invite all of you. We're a pretty active club. We meet over in Heston, and if anybody's local, you're certainly welcome to join us. What we did is we put together sort of a calendar of our events that we know of already this year. On the back table, you're welcome to take one and certainly join us for any of the events we have. A few of them, because I know there's a lot of people from not necessarily this area. Get my cheat sheet.
Lesson plan.
I should try teaching. So the first event that may interest all of you is Saturday, April 21st. The college students, McPherson college students, have a swap meet. This is actually the 4th consecutive year. This year we've got a really good local group of Model T people that have taken vendor spaces. I think we're up to 9 Model T people that have vendor spaces, and I think there's almost 40 spaces sold. So relatively small, but there's going to be a lot of Model T people there with Model T stuff for sale. There's flyers for that back there. Certainly be glad to have anybody join us. If you're interested in taking a space and selling some excess stuff that I know some of us tend to accumulate, it's $15 a space, and it goes to the students, so it's a good cause, and I think it's relatively inexpensive. After that, we have Saturday, May 5th, and again, all these flyers are on the back table. Please help yourself. Is the annual McPherson College Car Show. Really good turnout for Central Kansas of pre-war cars, not a lot of hot rods, and we get a lot of people that come just for that show. People that bring cars out that don't usually bring them to other events. Big event that hopefully will attract some people from different areas. Memorial Day weekend, the end of May, we've got a weekend tour. Steve Robbins and crew are putting together a tour in Concordia, Kansas, which is kind of north central. 2.5-day tour. Be glad to have anybody join us. We'll have more information on that soon. And then the final thing I want to mention, and then I will turn the microphone back over. The end of September, and there are flyers back there, we're doing sort of a different event, we think. We're calling it the New York to Paris Run. If you remember now, 110 years ago, it was just probably one of the greatest automobile races of all time. We're doing a very small reenactment of that, probably a 50, 60 mile run. The flyer's back there. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. Absolutely a different event from anything I've ever seen around here or even back on the East Coast. And should be a lot of fun. Be glad to have anybody join us.
Thank you, Chris. From now till lunchtime, we're going to talk about my TT Muncie, which is very similar to a car Muncie, other than, of course, it's larger. And then we'll get right after this to the Warford. Due to some more technical issues and such with videoing and cameras and computers, don't really have anything in the way of footage to show you, so I'm going to describe everything, which I think in the end you'll probably find it just as informational and possibly just as boring, but it'll go a lot faster. Trying to condense an hour and 15 minutes of video down to 20 minutes is a lot of work. And then if you run into any kind of technical issues, you get really frustrated. Anyway, so I'll begin with this transmission. This is a Muncie TT version of their Model T transmission. Back when I was 15, got into Model Ts, and this was one of the items that I picked up in my first big chunk of stuff. It was in a running TT chassis, and I ended up deciding to use this in a speedster project. So a few years later, when I was still in high school, I went ahead and tore it down and replaced the bearings and made gaskets and painted it, and it's basically sat in a corner of my storage unit for several years, having not yet utilized its use yet. So last weekend when we did the videotaping of tearing this apart, it was fairly straightforward. You take these 4 bolts off here in the top. It doesn't immediately pop off because in the case of when I put it together, I use silicone with the gasket, and I would today recommend probably a Permatex product called Permatex 2. It's a lightly hardening type of sealer. We did run into one of the 4 bolts being slightly out of standard size, so it was a little difficult to get off. It took a little time and everything, but once the top's off, if you hadn't already drained the grease, it'd be, you know, the time to do that.
Say a couple
Go ahead,
things, Jerry. So just a couple restoration tips that I like to point out to people. All of you are more experienced mechanics than some of them that I work with, but so when you've got a case half like this, especially on something aluminum, like those lovely aluminum KC Warfords over there, you know, your natural tendency is to take a pry bar or something heavy and then jam it in between those surfaces. And especially on a soft aluminum case, it's really easy to put a divot in that case and then cause a leak later. So typically what I like to do is use something fairly wide. Got a putty knife here. Around our shop, I actually keep some old drywall knives that are about this long, and those work very effectively for splitting cases, especially if they're stuck together with silicone and that kind of stuff. It will not mar up or otherwise destroy your case. In terms of sealants, I will respectfully, well, there are many opinions about sealants. The stuff I like to use is a product called Permatex Right Stuff, which, if you're not familiar with it, comes in kind of a Cheese Whiz style can. It's about 20 bucks a can, but it was developed by OE manufacturers in about the late 90s, early 2000s, somewhere around there, to create gaskets in less than a minute that are fluid tight and will not leak. And it is absolutely incredible stuff. I can
use the wrong stuff.
Yeah.
I refer to your right stuff as really the wrong stuff, because I swear you can put every bolt, not everything in the bottom of a pan, let that stuff sit up, take them all out, and go right to car for $2,000.
Yeah.
It's impossible to get it apart.
Yeah.
That's the wrong stuff.
Oh, you don't like it? Okay.
Oh,
Well.
it's too hard to get apart.
Okay.
Use Ultra.
Well. So
Ultra black.
ultra black is fine too. So
There's an opinion.
diversity of opinions, right? So okay. I'll let Jerry continue then.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, okay. So we basically had the top off on this particular transmission, as well as the car versions. Unlike the Warford, the gear set is held in by, since they're a ball bearing type rather than a tapered roller type, they're held in with a retaining ring, and in this case, this is the front mounting for the case, and the rear mounting. As you can see on this one, there's a little bit of a built-in lip already. Remove those, pop them off, gasket issues, you know, get it all apart. And then it's a lot easier to then start pulling everything apart. The unique thing on this one also is the output shaft bearing is held in this retainer that's bolted in underneath that rear bracket that holds the front of the torque tube. The end play is set on this shaft by being locked into this plate and bolted into the back. The other retaining ring is what is used on the front input shaft gear in the front of the case behind this housing here, or this bracket here. We had pretty much no real issues once we got the gaskets off and cleaning everything out. The bottom counter shaft was a little unique in that because of the idler gear for the reverse, it just didn't want to just come straight out. The reverse gear was kind of like holding it in. So we removed a pipe plug on the back here of the transmission, and that gave us access to punch out the shaft that the gear itself rides on, which is this one right here. It's held in on the opposite end with a cotter pin, and once we got that out, the gear was loose enough that we could then jockey around the bottom counter shaft enough that we got the bearing off, and then we could tilt it and pull it straight up and then pull the reverse gear out.
I want to make a point there.
Sure.
So one of the interesting things about this TT Muncie is that it incorporates a reverse gear, which most of the auxiliary transmissions of the era did not. So you could potentially, with this TT Muncie, more or less eliminate the Ford transmission of low and reverse if you wanted to, in that you would still have reverse capability using this idler gear. So I should point out that this reverse idler, as you see here, adds one more direction of reversal. Adds one more direction of reversal into the system in order to provide that reverse ratio, right, like so, using a direct here. Anyway, the point being about that it's kind of unusual to add reverse into the system as well as an under-end direct, because you already have reverse on the Ford Planetary. So potentially out of this Muncie, you could get 7 speeds forward and 3 in reverse, because you've got, if you did reverse in the Ford transmission and reverse in the Muncie, that would give you another forward ratio that way. So when we were taking it apart, I just found it rather curious to provide a reverse gear in the auxiliary transmission. So.
Would come in handy for adjusting the carburetor. You could set it all up and then jump out there and just walk along, walk beside it. Yeah. Don't think I haven't thought of that, and was planning on trying that if I ever got a truck done with this transmission. The bearings on the counter shaft are held on with these retainers with a simple bolt. Works pretty efficiently there. They also, to give some semblance of not a preload at all, just a position inside the case. There's a pair of keepers. Well, they're a spacer actually, and it just fits behind the flat cover that's just held on with a series of 3 bolts on both ends. There's also on this transmission a PTO cover. The Warford also has one. The Muncie, less common so, but it also has one. The car Muncies do not have that feature. Pretty much after that, you get it tore apart. You would go through the normal cleanup, check everything out as per the earlier discussion, and then if needed, replace the bushing in the idler for the reverse gear. That's the only plain bearing in this transmission. The other 5 bearings are made up of 4 ball bearing, and as a note, last night I double checked the prices of these on the internet. One bearing is $53, that was the most expensive. The next most expensive bearing was $26, and the other 2 bearings were both under $20 a piece. So you're looking at under $130 to replace those 4 bearings and the bushing for the idler. The needle or roller bearing type bearing does not have a part number on it, and without actually getting a pair of calipers out and measuring it and looking it up, I have no idea what this bearing's currently at. The experience I recall, that was about a $30 bearing in 1978 when I went and replaced it. It looks like a very small version of the rear axle bearing in a standard Model T rear axle. If I remember correctly, when I did tear this apart the first time, like a Model T bearing that's been overused, it basically came out in pieces.
So I want to point out a couple things. This is what they now call a journal style roller bearing. And I think, as a number of you probably know, the original style of these typically has a set of spiral grooves in it. And I think there's a common kind of conception out there that those spiral grooves are there to hold oil. And that's not actually the case. These bearings were developed by Hyatt the Hyatt Roller Bearing Company, and I don't remember where they were located, somewhere in Michigan. But Hyatt developed a technology where they could take a flat piece of steel and then wind it around a mandrel into a spiral, thus creating a hollow bearing. They were then heat treated such that they basically were a spring. So consequently, those original Hyatt bearings are able to take quite a bit of load this way in that they can actually compress under load. It should tell you something that, so let me point out that Hyatt was bought by Billy Durant of General Motors fame. When he was putting together General Motors, it was one of his major acquisitions. And it should probably be an indication to you that Ford was buying bearings from Hyatt for their rear axle. They were buying the competitors' bearings to use because they were of such quality. The tooling to make all that stuff, as far as I've ever been able to determine, was destroyed sometime around World War II. And after that, we've just gone to solid roller replacements, which are kind of completely inferior to those old Hyatt bearings. So just like the Model T rear axle bearings, if you run across good stocks of those, like preserve them at all costs. And of course, most of these Hyatt bearings were made to standard sizes. That one looks like it's, I'm going to say 5/16. So usually if you take a micrometer or a pair of calipers, some kind of precision measuring device, you can determine how much those are worn by miking each individual roller all the way around the bearing and determining how much they may or may not be worn. But if you don't have anything better, you can use a modern reproduction one. But certainly an original is far preferable.
If in a pinch, could you put a plain bearing in there if you knew you weren't going to be driving the vehicle other than a couple parades a year?
You know, the thing is, I always worry about the next guy.
The next guy, yeah. That pretty much covers disassembly. We'll go ahead and throw this all back together here in a few minutes. I mean, over the next few minutes. Starting with the counter shaft and the reverse gear, there'll be some banging. I mean, it's not quiet when you're using hammers and chisels, or punches rather. You'll get a kind of a feel for how to put it back together. In this particular training, we didn't have to deal anything with any kind of hydraulic press. But when we tore the counter shaft out of that Chicago down there, due to the fact that it had a little bit of rust in it and it just being stubborn, we ended up having to put it on a press to get it to pop out enough to then we could tilt it out. So I'll go ahead and put the counter shaft in after I put the reverse gear in.
So yeah, you can see Jerry there made up a nice little fixture. A handy way of supporting transmissions is to use the drain plug feature. And if you take a piece of pipe, you can typically make a fixture that'll sit in the vise and that'll hold your case nice and steady.
Question for you.
Yeah, Mike?
Out of the different ones, Chicago, Warford, Muncie, do you favor any one over the other as far from a restoration standpoint?
Need the question through the microphone.
Hang on,
I'll do it.
You can.
My question is, the various transmissions represented today, Chicago, Muncie, Warford, do you find any one of the particular brands easier from a restoration standpoint, parts availability, bearings, what have you?
Well, I mean, the thing is, we're dealing, as you know, with sometimes well over 100-year-old parts, and so the question is coming up with good parts. And so I think what I've run across anyway is that the metallurgy and stuff tends to be better in the Warfords and Muncies than pretty much any other brand, so you're more likely to find a good one of those. The one, I mean, as I think we pointed out, the one disadvantage of the Warford is the one bearing that's not available. If it were me, I would, and I think, as you know, there's always a trade-off between end use and cost and all of those dynamics. I think really the best thing on the market are those KC Warfords. The shift technology, metallurgy, all of those others if I was going to build a serious car that I wanted to drive to Alaska or whatever, that's what I would do. But again, you know, not every car is going to see that kind of use, and so it kind of depends on your parts stash and what your end goal is. But
after working on tearing this Warford apart, my opinion of Warford's increased quite a bit. Basically having a Muncie for so many years, I was a Muncie guy, being that they're not a tapered bearing but a roller bearing. In this case, except for that one bearing, they're both for the Warford and for the Muncie are available brand new at a pretty reasonable price, a little over $100 for the bearings. That's pretty reasonable today's prices. Sometime probably by the end of the summer, I'll go through one of these car transmissions and see if there's a huge issue with bearings in those. But as far as this TT version, what I'm drawn to the Muncie over the Warford for is simply the reverse. If you did not need a reverse or want a reverse, I'd have no problem with a Warford.
So just general considerations in driving shafts. You can see Jerry's using a plastic hammer there. Usually like to use some kind of a non-ferrous hammer, you know, non-iron or steel. One of the issues I always have driving shafts back and forth is that especially if they have a cotter pin hole like that particular example, what you'll run into is if you beat too hard on those, or there's a dynamic I'm going to talk about here, but what will happen is you'll typically tend to raise a burr on the edge of that shaft and then make them very hard to drive in or out. So using non-ferrous materials is good. The other kind of dynamic there is you're better off to hit something with not too big of a hammer, but a bigger hammer with a harder blow than a light hammer with soft blows. The reason being that a lighter hammer and softer blows will tend to peen the metal or not actually move it in the case. So if I'm going to do something like that, one, I'll use a drift, by which a drift I mean some kind of a brass or steel punch in order to move against there. The reason being that when you use a drift like so, it tends to cushion your hammer blows and tend to cause less peening or movement of the metal on that shaft. The last thing I ever want to see people do is take a ball peen hammer and just wail directly on a shaft, because that's when you're likely to raise the edge. So plastic hammers are pretty useful too if things aren't really stuck. Dead blow hammers, you know, that are filled with lead shot are pretty useful also. If you happen to be into Babbitt work, a good use for all your old Babbitt is to melt those down into hammers. Babbitt makes a really very nice soft hammer material, much better even than lead in my opinion. So yeah, so you can see we've got our reverse gear in. Now we're going to load the counter shaft in. And that counter shaft, you'll see, has the front bearing still on it. That front bearing will then probably tap lightly into the case. Is it all right if I narrate?
Yeah, no, please.
Okay. All of these things tend to go together a little bit differently, depending upon the configuration of the different shafts. Not so much from auxiliary transmission standpoint, but just from a general transmission standpoint. The ones you want to be concerned about are if you see one that has like a blind reverse idler. What I mean by that is the reverse idler shaft goes in from the factory one way and then you can't drive it through because you can get yourself into a really sticky situation where you can't drive the reverse idler shaft back out easily that way. So, proper planning, as always, prevents poor performance.
And in that case, I put the bearing on just a little too far.
Also, I have to say, there's nothing like working on something when you have an audience. I'd be happy to entertain any questions if you guys have any. You got one over there?
Jerry mentioned car versus TT trans, and you mentioned the PTO output on a TT trans. Can you speak to just, say you're at a swap meet, you only have one tranny there, so you can't tell a size difference, or I guess you could maybe look at the ratios, but how do you tell a TT transmission from a car transmission?
Typically size. The Warfords are
So
considered.
so if you only have one transmission laying there, it's just going to come down to experience, knowing whether or not it's car versus TT.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, there are a number. If you go on the Northwest Vintage Speedsters website, Murray Fenstock, back in the Model T era, published a guide to basically all the different auxiliary transmissions. And it's useful reading if you're looking for one to see what's available that one way or the other. So, kind of looking over what the available options, I would say is a good thing to do if you're in the market.
Right. Well, more like I've got several and I don't know whether they're TT or car.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So does a Warford, you mentioned Muncie having a PTO and not having a PTO, does a Warford also, are there two variants of that, or are they all same as PTO?
The Warford truck transmissions did have an
Does have
available
a
PTO.
Okay.
My experience is the PTO option is a pretty uncommon, or having the actual PTO attachment is fairly uncommon. They don't seem to have sold a lot of those. So if you see one of those around, it might be desirable to someone.
Just wondering, what type of oil do you recommend putting back in these?
Oh boy, let's get into oil. Okay, so it's a good point. Okay, let's talk about what they would have used then. Yeah. So gear oils at that time were typically very thick, were derived from petroleum of some variety or another, and typically would have been equivalent to your 600 weight that we use in Model T rear axles and that sort of thing. Now, let me talk about modern gear oils. So, before I get to that, you'll see that Jerry's now got the countershaft installed, ball bearings on each side, spacers installed, and now he's got the cap for that countershaft bearing installed there. So, going back to oils, in 1927, Packard introduced hypoid gears in rear axles of their cars. Hypoid gears, hypoid ring and pinion set, is one in which the pinion gear is placed, so if I've got, if I've got a ring and pinion set, like so, let's say the center line of my ring and pinion set's right there. So Packard introduces a set of gears in 1927 where the pinion gear is placed below the center line of the ring gear. The reason they did that was to lower the drive shaft tunnel of the vehicle so that you could thereby lower the body down on the frame of the vehicle, gain a little bit stronger or lower, sleeker kind of appearance. The difficulty is, one, they had to figure out the machines to generate these things, and two, they had to come up with special additives in the oil because those teeth put extreme amounts of pressure on the gear teeth. So those additives, hypoid additives, are typically called extreme pressure additives, and they're that sulfur stuff you smell in gear oil that makes it stink so bad all over your hands. The kind of trade-off there is that those sulfur additives tend to have an affinity, or at least the old ones did, tend to have an affinity for any copper-based alloy. So those copper-based alloys like brass or bronze would tend to disintegrate under those hypoid gear additives. So for that reason, you'll see in the literature that you're not supposed to use EP, GL4 or higher gear oils in early rear axles, early transmissions, that sort of thing. In about the early, I haven't pinned down a date as to when this was, but in about the late 90s to early 2000s, they came up with better EP additives that do not attack brass and bronze. So in that case, GL4 or 5 gear oils are just fine to run in early car rear ends. I've got, in my car, I've got, I don't know, 3,000 or 4,000 miles on it. I've got brass thrust washers with bronze thrust washers in the rear axle. I run 8090 GL4 from the parts store, not had any issues. So to answer your question, what kind of oil should I use? 600 weight would be appropriate. It's kind of a traditional oil. I'll talk about why it might be a good idea. Or you could run like an 8090 or 8140 conventional gear oil in one of these things, likely without much issue. The other thing I'm going to say though is that a thicker oil can sometimes be pretty advantageous in these auxiliary straight cut transmissions, because what happens is it acts as a drag agent to bring or spin down the transmission and make them easier to shift, particularly when it comes to shifting into overdrive. So you lose some lubricating qualities and also some drag loss from the thicker oil, but potentially gain some shifting user friendliness. So you kind of have to weigh those things against one another. I might ask, since I've got the builder of the Elmer Lane here, what would you recommend in one of the new KC Warfords?
What I tell them is anything's better than nothing. I came over here for that.
Thank you very much. Hey, John, how many of them have you had
Well,
that have nothing in them?
One, 3,000 miles.
Lasted 3,000 miles
And-
with nothing in it.
I kept it and sent him another one that the only damage was there was a little bit of color on the ears, so we thought they had lost the heat treat, but it never had a bad bearing in it or anything. So I think you could get by with anything as long as it has something. But I tell them not to use a synthetic because it tends to leak and go through the
Yeah,
tail.
that is true. Absolutely. So there you have it from the guy who re-engineered these things. I've got another question up here, Mike. Comment?
Comment, I'd say. I've been
I've been told about not using EP oil in the Ruxtol rear end. I've called all over and doing research and stuff like that. I talked to a lady and she said, well, why don't you look for a hydraulic oil that they use in hydraulic systems. So I checked down to the local Cenex co-op, and he put me on an end-all, and I just can't remember the number of it. He said it's a straight mineral oil with no additives, and it's 140 weight. And this old, original Ruxtol book I have, they're going back to Model, Gargle. Okay. I cross-reference that stuff.
Yeah, that's the issue, is there's not much way to...
So I'm going to try it because I can, if it doesn't work, I can use oil in a tractor I have. That's got the engine, gears and hydraulic system all together. So I don't know. It's just something you got to just play with.
Yeah, in Ruxtol's, typically, the issue is in those that the planetary unit being kind of shielded from the oil. A 600 weight oil, from my understanding, doesn't tend to cling that well to those internal planetary gears.
That's what they said.
So I generally see recommended a 140 weight oil.
That's what they recommend.
The oil you're recommending or talking about there is what we would call a GL1 gear oil,
Yes.
which is typically a refined mineral oil
Right.
without any additives. If you go down the GL scale, GL1 is mineral oil, GL2 is typically designated for worm gears, 3 is a good all-around gear oil with no EP additives, 4 contains the extreme pressure additives, and then 5 is good for limited slip differentials, as you would find for top-off only, as you would find in modern cars. So I mean, if you want to be fussy about it, which is you're right, I would suggest like a good safe choice for any of these auxiliary transmissions would be like a GL3, either straight weight 90 weight or like an 80-90. would be what I would recommend. Other questions?
I heard John talk about not recommending synthetics, and I didn't catch the reason why no synthetics.
The reason that he mentioned was they tend to leak worse, which has been my experience as well. There's something about that, refined molecule size that's uniform that they generally tend to leak a little bit more. So you can see we've got our input and output shafts in now. Jerry's putting the rear retainer on.
Actually, this is the front.
Oh, I'm sorry, the front retainer.
We have a question back here.
Yeah.
Between synthetic and mineral gear oils, no problem with lubrication or increased wear patterns, anything other than just they might leak a little more?
The thing about a model, unless you've got something really, really hot, a Model T, the loads are so low that there would be no appreciable. The loads are so low and the life cycles are so long that there would be no appreciable difference, synthetic versus conventional. I will say I run whatever's cheap for oil in my car. I've run synthetic motor oil at one point or another, and it does leak worse. I will say that at cold temperatures, hand cranking is a whole lot easier, which I kind of liked. So. So how are we doing, Jerry? Any notes you have?
Yeah, I'll just look for the microphone.
Oh, sorry, I'm asking you to talk.
Mike's got it. Just hold it up.
Okay, I got it back together, minus a couple little wrenches, whatever. I'm going to leave the top off, so if later somebody wants to look inside and play around, it'll be easily accessible. But basically, that's it. Without having, because it's all ball bearing, no preload to any of the bearings, it goes together pretty normal, just bolted back together. I didn't bother, of course, with this, with gaskets or whatever. There's only 4 gaskets on this, one under the top cover, the PTO cover, and then the rear adapter and the front adapter. Those are probably the only 2 that are somewhat critical as far as gasket thickness. I would imagine somewhere probably around a 25 thousandths thick gasket would be sufficient for everything, really. The only other thing I wanted to note about Muncie's in general over the other transmissions that I've seen, if you look at this front snout adapter piece, whatever you want to call it, at the 9 o'clock and 3 o'clock position, there is an extra set of bolt holes. The standard Ford bolt patterns here, but these extras come out here. And what that's for is, and I've only seen this on the Muncie, if you look on the car transmission, it also has the same arrangement. And what that was for was on the Model T hogshead and pan, the second bolt forward of where the 4th main went, where this bolted up to, you would remove that bolt, and they had a L-shaped with a little tweak in it, little bar with threaded ends on it, and you would replace that bolt, and it would come back and come into here, and then you'd have another nut here that would also cinch it up. So you had 6 instead of 4 bolts holding it to the back of the TT. And as you can see on the car, it's a different end cap, but the bolt pattern for the drive shaft ball is identical to a Ford. It also has a provision for a support bolt here. And one of my other transmissions and this piece down here were purchased together, although I did not remove them from a chassis, so I have no idea whether it was a car or a truck. But dimensionally, they're the same length from front to back, both the car and the TT, so I'm sure many, and I've seen it myself, car versions were in trucks also. The only thing I can really comment on that, as far as the support piece was, I would think, since I also have the original support that came with this transmission and it's identical to this one on the floor, is that for a car or a truck, the U-bolts that went over the frame would be a different length. And just like on the U-bolts that are here, there was a spring on the underside above the nut, and that would allow a little bit of flex. Anybody have any more questions? Okay, use this. This transmission is the same model as this transmission, and in pretty much the same condition that this one was a week ago when we tore it apart. As you can see, there's decades of rust and grease that's solidified into some sort of tar-based concoction. The first thing I noticed with tearing these apart, my thought was, oh, these are going to be much worse than the Muncie. And then, except for one thing, they really aren't. And again, this transmission, as Luke mentioned earlier, uses a tapered preload type of roller bearing. And the way they accomplish that, and I'll talk a minute about that before I get into really great detail, is both the counter shaft and the main shaft have these roller bearings on it, and consequently they stay preloaded inside of a bearing race. On the main shaft, that race is held in with these screw-in collars, and as you can see, this has got a bunch of little divots all the way around the circumference, and the reason for that is this would get screwed in. The case at both ends has got this fine thread, and it just screws in and it takes up that clearance and such. So when you're looking at something like this, the first thought I had was, oh, this is going to be terrible to take apart. And as you can see, if you look in here, it's full of rust. So when you get one of these, and like we did with this, I started soaking this down a couple weeks before. I'd take a wire brush and I'd knock as much out of the way as I could. I'd soak it down some more. Something that we didn't do but I think would work really well is if you had one of those about an inch diameter type wire nub type wire wheels. It's not really not a wheel, it's kind of like a pencil eraser that's made out of wire, except it's about an inch in diameter. And you just, like spot welding, you kind of go in there and just start knocking everything you can out of there so that you can get that penetrating fluid down in there where those threads are. And it's self-serving. You want those threads clear of any debris so you can back the nut off. Without being able to back the nut off, you're not going to get this apart. So we worked on that last week. Then when we tore it apart, the first thing we did, just because it was in the way, was and this is unique to the cast iron TT versions, they have this little snout on the front, and it adds length to the transmission, and it uses a standard, unlike the Muncie that has a special rear half of the U-joint, it uses a standard Ford Model T U-joint in there. Well, just like the standard drive shaft, you got to rotate this out of the way, you got to clean this up. There's a cap on there, just like on a normal drive shaft. You got to pull the cap on the top and the cap on the bottom, and you can drive that pin out because the tranny is stubbed just like the front of the drive shaft. So you got to pull all that out before you can unbolt. Well, technically you could unbolt this first, but it makes an alignment issue kind of crazy. But once you get that U-joint off of there, then you can take these 4 bolts off, and then this whole front piece comes off, and basically this then looks exactly like this end, except for the fact that instead of having a square hole, it's got a square shaft. The other slight difference is on the U-joint end, the piece that screws in actually screws over the shaft and then is held inside the front there like this. It uses a special washer that's staked up. Once this special nut then is threaded down on there to lock it. And this is what you would use with the race that's in the front of the housing. This race for this bearing right here fits in the front of the housing. So it's actually the other size one, but you get the idea. And this is how you preload the input shaft. Again, and I'm overemphasizing this, these are fine threads. You got to be able to take them apart to get this transmission apart. So rust is probably in those two critical areas the only really major issue. What was really interesting about this transmission is it looked actually probably a little worse than this one initially. And until I took the PTO cover off and looked inside and saw nice greasy gears, I was under the assumption this whole thing was just a big thing of rust. So take a wrench, pull it apart. At first when we were trying to get it apart, it didn't want to come apart. We thought maybe they were left-hand threads. They're not. But we used, in these grooves, 2 opposing punches and then a pry bar in there. And it probably took a good 4 or 5 minutes. Once it finally started to loosen up, to back out and then come apart. Did you have something, Luke?
Oh, I just wanted to say, if you're looking at swap meet transmissions or hedgerow stuff, as I do, rust is really your enemy when it comes to gears and bearings. What'll happen is once that rust forms an etched surface on either a bearing race or on a gear, it's not going to get any better from there. You can tolerate minor amounts of it, but if you see any deep pits whatsoever, it usually has destroyed the surface hardening or hardening on the bearing races, etc. And from there, you will not. Nothing pretty is going to happen. So try not to. If you see rusty gears, I would walk away. Okay.
The other comment was once these end caps for the counter shaft came off, because they're held in there with a tapered roller bearing. Here you can see what's left of the bearings on this shaft. In fact, they just basically disintegrated. The rollers fell out and the cages, one of them was bent up pretty bad. Once you got these out of the way of these and all of that out of there, the counter shaft was completely out of the way, so it come out really pretty nice. Not a big issue there. So pretty much we're ready to put this back together.
Let me talk a little bit about, there's one kind of unusual thing about these Warfords in terms of construction. So say they use tapered roller bearings. Do you have that front tapered roller bearing for it? So what's kind of unusual here is that generally speaking, in most kind of more modern applications, you'll see that transmissions will use just a setup about like this, where you see we've got opposing tapered roller bearing on the output shaft, opposed tapered roller bearing on the input shaft there. The Warford is unusual in that there's actually what I would call the 4th tapered roller bearing. You'll see that we've got this one, that oddball one that we can't get replacements for. But it's kind of unusual in that we've got one here, there, here, and then there's another one that comes up here. So we've actually got 4 total tapered roller bearings in that assembly, whereas most contemporary transmissions, or really anything built after, not anything really, use typically only 3 instead of that 4 type setup. One of the questions you should always ask yourself if you see tapered roller bearings is that preload question, right? How is that set? So in this case, we've got those threaded adjusters on each end that are going to set our preload on those. Now, the other question we should ask ourselves is, how much preload is appropriate? How much drag or not do we want on this set of tapered roller bearings and this set of tapered roller bearings? And despite my pretending I'm not a bearing engineer, so what I can tell you from my experience setting up just all varieties of transmissions is they usually, in most instances, go for roughly 0 preload, or that is no end play in a transmission type application like this. There's always a trade-off in that the less preload you have, the less strength you have, right? Because there's more ability for those gears to move around, kind of deform. But the more preload you start putting on these things, the more drag you incur, and the more likely you're to destroy, lubrication and that kind of thing. So there's always that basic trade-off. Most modern transmissions run in what I would call kind of a preload neutral situation, where there's virtually no drag and no end play on those bearings. Automotive wheel bearings, tapered roller bearings, like the Timkins that we typically use on the front of a Model T, are usually designed to have a slight amount of end play. Usually that's between about 5 and 10 thousandths. When you get into rear axle bearings, like on pinion bearings, they're typically set up for a reasonable amount of drag. What you do there is typically use an inch-pound torque wrench, measure the amount of turning torque on those, and set them at about 10 to 15 inch-pounds of drag as they rotate around. So usually, usually my experience with transmissions is that they're set up at kind of a 0, no end play, no preload. And so as I was adjusting these, as I adjust, or we will adjust, these threaded adjusters, that's the condition we'll go for. Okay. Questions or comments there? So the question was, what about the counter shaft, which is a very excellent question. And our counter shaft in this case has these tapered roller races right here, these tapered roller bearing races on the interior here. And then you're going to see that there's a series of shims right there that set our preload back and forth there. So in this case, pry those apart a little bit. But those shims were originally manufactured probably in different sizes to account for machining differences in the case, machining differences in these end caps in order to achieve that correct amount of preload one way or another. Of course, we could remake, original Warford shims aren't going to be available. You could typically remake those out of steel or brass shim stock as needed if you need a preload adjustment. Other questions I can answer? I had a rather bad drive shaft experience lately, which I won't discuss in detail, but the question was, how do you determine how much of the drive shaft to cut out? The answer is that you should take, on a Warford, it would be from, the way I would measure it out anyway, is from this pinhole on the input U-joint to that pinhole there. Should tell you the total distance that you need to take out of the drive shaft. There are also published figures, generally speaking, at least for the more common auxiliary transmissions. But lacking that, I would just take a fairly precision measurement from pinhole to pinhole in order to get a measurement on how much to cut out. The issue would be that you might find that sometimes I think some of these Ford U-joints have a slightly variable length on this side, and these tail shafts might have a slightly variable length on that side. So if you just take end to end, you may not come up with a very accurate measurement. So I think that pinhole to pinhole measurement would be a lot closer.
What we're doing here is we're trying to get the old race off the ends of the counter shaft.
So you set up using a bearing splitter there.
How about cutting the radius rod?
Boy, Vern, you're just full. So Vern just asked, question is, how much do you cut the radius rods?
How do you cut them? Where? How do you put them together?
Where do you cut them?
Yeah,
You know,
how do you put them together?
I've seen a couple different schemes for that. A lot of times what you guys will do is just basically overlap them. So if you put a cut in the radius rod, you can then expand out and then shorten them that way to where they basically fit. In terms of getting the right cut or the right adjustment, when you set up one of the Model T rear end, what I always do as a final step is to take the measurement from the center hole of the axle ends to the ball cap, and then make sure my distances are right this way and that, using the radius rod nuts so that you're absolutely 100% sure you get them vertical. So as long as you get your radius rods cut to where you can get that measurement, it should be appropriate. If you're good with trigonometry, you could definitely do the calculations there since it's all a triangle. I was never that good at math.
I've run one of these since 1970.
So, okay.
Warford. He was asking which one is the most preferred. I just walk by the cast iron stuff. That's heavy. You don't need to add your weight to your car. And the aluminum case Warford, I've had 3 of them. Drivability, they're noisy. This I'm talking original. They're noisy in overdrive and underdrive because you're going through that secondary shaft. In direct drive, they're just like a Model T. I've got a 4-to-1 in my rear end ratio, and by the time it's in overdrive and that, I'm about 3-to-1 on output. It robs power, going through that extra shaft, it robs power. That's just the way it is.
Because I can hear it, I guess other people couldn't.
Oh, okay. Well, so back up a little bit on the Warford. I've run one since 1970 in my depot hack, put lots of miles on it. It's an original aluminum case, and I learned about that from Bud Boat. Some of you remember Bud Boat in the Wichita Club there. He had an 11 Model T with a Warford in it. He was one of the first guys I ever saw that could do over 50 miles an hour, 55 miles an hour constantly in his Model T. I know, we're doing that now, but this was back in the old days. Well, that was what he used. He said, you want an aluminum case Warford. He was an old time guy. And, it's a 3-speed over under direct. I'm running 4-to-1 in the rear end, and it gives me about 3-to-1 when I'm in overdrive. It's kind of noisy. I don't shift it on the fly. Bud did. I pull off the side of the road when I come into town and downshift into just a straight, no overdrive, no underdrive. When I get to the outside edge of town, I pull over, shift it into overdrive, and take off down the country. I've never had it jump out of gear like that. And I have a Ruxel. I much more prefer the Warford. I kind of like to try a lane Warford. I think they're, with the constant mesh gears and being able to shift, helical cut gears, that'll keep them from being so noisy. I think it's kind of the ultimate. Like I say, I've never run one, but they sound good.
So Vern, I might ask you, so you always shift yours and then stop?
Yeah.
Yeah. You run auxiliary brakes or?
No, I've never had trouble with it jumping out.
Okay.
I've been to the mountains with it, Colorado and other places, Kentucky, but it's never had a problem. The deal about cutting the drive shaft, I think, is I wish there was something that was a little more definite on it, is because when you move when you put the transmission in, you're going straight back as opposed to going down to the rear end. So you're going this way and then coming down. So you got a little different triangle to it. And that length of that drive shaft is fairly critical. You've got your thrust bearing up the front. I'm using the original stuff. Some guys use the Reagan stuff. I've never done one of those. but like on the back end of your U-joint, that surface back there is the thrust surface that fits on the front of your drive shaft bushing up front. So a lot of guys, you know, they'll just slap a drive shaft on there, but that needs to be smooth, not pitted. You look at it and be sure it's smooth. And the other thing I've done for the radius rods is the original ads, I think, said to cut them off, lap them over, and put 2 bolts in them. I didn't think that looked too good. And this is the one failure I've had, is I cut it off right in front of the Y and then welded the tube, little bead weld around there. And that failed, and it wasn't out on the road, it's when I chained it down in the trailer. And I got it out of the trailer and looked, and the thing had disconnected there. So I went back in, took it back apart, welded the tang on there, and then slid the tube over and welded it around there, and then riveted it too, to help strengthen it some. But other than that, I put all new bearings in it, thought, well, this will help. It didn't do a darn thing for it, you know, outside that one that you can't buy.
Yeah.
But I really like it. I like it far better than a Ruxel.
Very good. Thank you, Vaughn.
As you can see up here, I've got an adapter. This is I'm assuming they were made by Warford, since I've seen them mostly with Warfords. You could cut the drive shaft off at the rear. This would replace the flange, and with these bolts and this groove, you had some leeway to move it. You still had to figure out what the actual drive shaft length was and shorten it. But as far as the housing goes, if you were off an 1/8, 3/16 or whatever, you could pretty much slip this to accommodate your error in measurement. And I also have seen these in the passenger car drive shaft dimensions. I'm assuming that Warford sold these, and they also had cast radius rod ends. They would, in their flyer, tell you to cut them at a certain length and then shove these in there and then re-rivet them. So that was one option. Okay, so we've got the races, the internal races on the counter shaft tapered roller bearings off, and we're going to put the new bearings on here.
So I might just talk a little bit about installation of bearings. There are kind of a couple ways you can go about it. The main thing is to prevent damage to the bearing. My preferred way usually is to do something about like what they're going to do. Using a press, I find, is kind of the handiest way. If you're lacking a press, as we are, looks like we're just, and it also depends on the friction fit, on how much of a press fit they are. But using a brass drift or a drift in general works pretty well. Some guys do like to take oil baths, heat a bath of oil up to about 300, 350 degrees to expand the bearing, and then use that, heated expansion in order to get those on there. And that certainly is an acceptable method. The key is to keep temperatures, if you're going to heat a bearing, at a uniform consistency and below about 350, 400 degrees. Otherwise, you're going to start to draw back and re-temper the bearing and destroy the heat treating on it. So I try to keep heat away from bearings at all if I can, but an oil bath would be the appropriate way to do that.
You got a press over there, so we'll take a minute and we'll go press these on.
So all of this is my first introduction into auxiliary transmission. So pardon me if I ask a question that doesn't sound right. So I've heard you talk about the Warford original trucks, cars, cast iron, aluminum. So is there both aluminum housings for both trucks and cars and cast iron housings for both trucks and cars?
My understanding is that the aluminum cases are primarily car. You don't typically find the truck ones so much in that configuration.
But there would be a cast iron housing for a car?
Cast iron car and aluminum car.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So the new KC ones excuse me, the new KC ones are aluminum, cast aluminum. We've got one over here if you want to take a look at it. I might mention, I'll put this down on the bench while they're pressing and talk about some of the differences in the KC one versus an original Warford. So I think, as was mentioned, pop that up a little bit so we can get a view inside here. Okay. So one of the important differences between the new KC Warfords and the originals is that an original Warford is a sliding gear transmission, right? It takes the gear here and moves it back and forth. One of the refinements of this KC Warford is that they are constant mesh. What I mean by that is the speed gears here rotate on the main shaft, and it's only when I engage that dog right there that they come into engagement with the main shaft and thus send power through the unit. So you'll see here I've got my direct and underdog right here. So when I'm right up here, that's direct, 1-to-1, so yeah, that would be direct. And then my under would be right here, because you can see I've got large gear on the main shaft, small gear on the counter shaft. And then right back here would be my overdrive, as you see right there. So one of the advantages to that technology of using shifting dogs in constant mesh is considerably less wear on the gears, and generally a little bit smoother shifting, because you can see to shift, instead of having that relatively fine-toothed gear to slide back in and out of the counter shaft, I really only have about 6 or 8 dogs, so there's less, there's significantly less interplay. I'm trying to think of the correct way to say that, but significantly less kind of chances for clash. In addition, you'll see that unlike our Warford, our original Warford, this guy uses nice quality seals on both sides, neoprene lip seals, and also, all the benefits of modern metallurgy and heat treating that would be pretty useful. So these guys have theirs on. You got those bearings on?
Yep.
Good deal.
What's the difference in weight between an original cast iron Warford and the new KC Warford?
Okay, so Jerry tells me a new one is 42 pounds. I would guess one of those original cast iron ones is probably about 100 by the time it's all said and done. So, doesn't sound like much, 40 pounds, I don't know, but you get a 2,000 pound car and it starts adding up pretty fast. Is there a question up here, Mike?
Price on that brand new aluminum.
A new KC Warford, I haven't priced them lately. They were, I think, 2,800, 2,850. Yeah. I think. So, in my experience, that's a very reasonable price for what you're getting.
Okay, what also makes this a little more unique is that the front input shaft, which is this piece right here, is actually supported by 2 tapered roller bearings, angled opposite of each other. This is how it would sit in there. The race for this bearing is still in the case, and we're going to reuse that. So this would get installed like this, straight in here like this. And then, I'll hold that for a second. Okay, and then we put this race in here. See how the angle is opposite. So we'll probably, for safety's sake, I'll put that in after, or before I put that in. There's also a shoulder inside that would support the backside of that race. I've got about 5/16 to pound this down in.
I get the question, well, I think what we're doing is fine, but use a brass hammer, use soft driver, aluminum, something like that. Most bearing races are heat treated to, I know you may not know what this means, but most of them are Rockwell hardness about 60 or 62. And in comparison, your average steel punch is maybe Rockwell 30. So you're very, very unlikely to put a mark in one of those bearing races using even a standard steel punch. So using a brass punch is fine. That one's not real hard, or not real hard to get in. One of the concerns I always have is about brass flakes coming off and getting trapped in my assemblies. So I typically will just take a hard steel punch or, normal strength steel punch and drive those in. Somebody had earlier mentioned ejector pins. Those are typically like Rockwell 55, 58, and if you hit a bearing race hard enough with one of those, you could probably put a mark in it. But standard kind of steel punches, it's not an issue.
Is that other race not available, or are you just taking time right now?
It was in excellent shape, including the bearing. The one that we're replacing slips over, and it just sees more abuse getting it in and out. So
we had a couple of these that had some rust pits in them that we were a little concerned about. The bearing looked okay otherwise, but we were just concerned primarily that that rust might develop into worser things.
okay, so we're going to put the counter shaft in.
So those counter shaft caps are shimmed, are they gasketed too, or just shimmed?
So the question was, are the counter shaft caps, they're shimmed, are they gasketed as well to seal?
There's
The
no
answer
gasket,
is there is no
just
gasket.
shims.
So
And
potentially, if I can see one of those caps here.
yeah, I was going to say there's probably about 7,000 or 8,000 steel.
So you can see, sorry, I'm getting out of the way of the camera here. So you can see that cap. Back in the 20s and teens, everything marked its territory. And so a couple drips from the counter shaft of 600 weight would just not be abnormal. On an original Warford, if I was trying to create one with no leaks, what I would probably do there is to take it and machine, just put this in the lathe, machine a small groove in there, and then put an O-ring in there to try and seal it. Or some RTV on the shims would probably do that as well for you, but certainly an O-ring groove would. Well, what we're going to try and do is just set up with the original shims, even though we've got some new bearings, and we'll just see where our preload comes out. We don't have a dial indicator today, but the kind of appropriate way, or one of the appropriate ways of setting preload would be to take a dial indicator, put it on our case, put the needle on our cluster gear or counter shaft, move that back and forth, see potentially how much end play we have, and then adjust our shims to where we have no preload, or maybe just a slight amount more, just a slight amount of end play, or maybe not, somewhere in there. The maximum I would want to see end play wise on that would be probably 2 to 3 thousandths, maybe a little more. High power applications, you typically want to see less. Something that's going to have 80 foot-pounds of torque through it, I wouldn't be too concerned. One question that often comes up is pre-lubrication. What to do about lubricating transmissions before you put them in the car. Whereas engine lubrication is pretty important to get a good film started for startup, especially on plain bearings. Usually these anti-friction bearings once you fill the thing with oil and the counter shaft rotates about 3 times, they're completely lubricated. So other than if it's going to be stored for a while, it's not a bad idea to put a light coating of oil on everything to prevent corrosion, but I don't get overly concerned with packing everything with grease or some other kind of lubricant in order to put those together. I do, generally speaking, recommend changing lubricant after about 100 miles, maybe a little more than that, just in case any contaminants have gotten in the oil. The other thing on rebuilds is I will, if at all possible, try to add some kind of a magnet, usually on the drain plug. Dorman, for example, makes nice magnetic drain plugs that have a rare earth magnet that will pick up any kind of metal debris. And I should say that some metal debris is normal from the gears and bearings. So if you pull one apart and there's a puddle of metal in there, it's not necessarily the end of the world. Question also often comes up about torque specifications. And the answer is that there were practically no torque wrenches before about World War II. So there usually are not published torque specifications on these. If you want torque values, you can use a standard torque chart and just figure that these fasteners are roughly grade 2. So I think those are 5/16, 18. So usually a grade 2 fastener is about 15 foot-pounds, or in the case of Jerry, about 1 oomph, right?
Half a oomph.
Half a oomph.
I break things with 2 oomphs, so. Okay, we took the skinniest shim out, and it's
Pretty stiff.
it's very stiff.
Okay.
We'll fix that later, but it turns, but and the main reason we took it out was it also had some damage, so we're gonna have to make a new one. But as you can see, I'll flip this around, we can zoom in. I'll try to get my cell phone light in here so we can see. There we go, okay. Thank you. That'll work great, okay. In fact, this spot right here is the bearing cap that holds the race that we just installed. You can't really see that at the other end because it's not quite as deep and the gear is more in the way. I'll show you that it does turn barely. But yeah, it would definitely need a new shim made and then properly installed. But for today's sake, we're done with installing the counter shaft.
Oh boy. So just precision feel. If I were to put an inch-pound torque wrench on that and spin it, I'd guess it's at about 35 to 40 inch-pounds of drag, which, to give you some idea, like a heavy truck rear end, like a Dana 80 or 90 used in a 1-ton truck, that would be the amount of drag that you would set the pinion bearings on for it. So pretty substantial. If you were to put that together with thick oil, it would not last. So it would blew those bearings pretty rapidly.
Okay, we installed the input shaft, and now we screw this collar down.
So then the appropriate way to set the preload on that input bearing, on that set of input bearings, would be to, once we've got that counter shaft at 0 preload, we would then tighten that down to where we did not add additional drag, but we've removed all the end play out of the input shaft. Again, I'm assuming on these that these Warfords should run with approximately 0 load and no end play on the tapered roller bearings. You can play a little bit with that stuff depending upon how much power you want to put through one and how much
Right now there's
less drag you want.
nearly 0 movement this way, and there's just a little bit of a rocking, and that's because the counter shaft's keeping it from completely turning. Next, you would use, hopefully if you had a new one of these little star washers, you'd place it on the front here. It has it's keyed so it won't turn. And then you would use a socket, hopefully, to put this on. And this was probably the most difficult thing we had. I mean, granted, it was more exposed than the other end, but they only gave us maybe 3/16 of a nut surface to put and we probably ended up using a 14-inch crescent wrench to get it to go.
So the way that we finally got that loose was to stand this transmission end right here in a vise, on a big solid vise, and then using a crescent we were able to finally pop that loose. But one technique that you can use on any manual transmission that's pretty handy for working on them is if you put the transmission in 2 gears at once, it'll always lock the input and output shafts solid so that you can get some distance to work against. So quite often for like on that Muncie, the counter shaft on it had bolts holding the bearings on each end. So to get those loose, we just locked it in 2 gears at once, and we were able to get some leverage against it to work fairly well.
Okay, in order to get the gears on, we had to make sure this was not present. And I'll flip this around and we'll be able to kind of look at this.
So if you're doing a lot of transmission work, one of the things I like to do is drill a hole in the bench, and that way, if you've got a tip sticking out like that, you can stick that down in that hole in your bench, and then you get a nice, even, solid work surface to work on.
Okay, now we're going to put the race in over the ball bearing on the output shaft, and it seems to actually be kind of going in pretty good by itself. I mean, you only have to tap it with a hammer, which actually makes sense since this has also got an adjustment nut on it. And this is how you would take up that end plate. Okay, now we have the final nut. This is the one that is also locked in place a little differently though. It uses a special bolt that has a pin built into the end, and it screws in over here on the side. Okay, the thing that just popped in my mind just as I was doing this is very reminiscent of doing the front wheel bearings on your Model T. And now that I've got it pretty firm, I'm checking fore and aft, and I've got no movement that way. There's no preload, it's just finger tight, so I would probably take it and turn it till the next hole lines up. Which literally was about 3 degrees, not very much. Put the lock screw in, see if it lines up. And I'm actually a little high, so I'm gonna have to back it off just a hair. And there it goes. So basically, the only thing left now is to put the cover for the PTO on. You would use a gasket, and there's these 6 bolts. You've got the front snout. I'd line the input shaft out in such a way that the hole was straight up and down, so when you went to drive the new U-joint pin through these holes right here, there's one of these on the top and the bottom, just like a standard Ford drive shaft. In fact, I think the part that screws into there, they probably bought them from Ford because they look exactly like a Ford one. And then you basically finish assembling the top. We'll leave it open for people to come take a look at. Anybody have any questions? Oh, I guess we could comment. We haven't yet restored the shifter. It is kind of nice that they have a top plate where you're able to get in here also and get stuff lubed up and everything, but as in a lot of these rods that the shift forks go on are rusted inside here, so it's going to be a lot of soaking and some gentle persuasion to get them to loosen up. If you were inclined to just say, oh, I want to tear this apart right now, I'll just replace those shafts, it could be done. Some drill rod, and then pin these little adapters on the front where the shift fork, not the shift fork, but the shift rod goes down into. As you can see on the end of these shift rods, the detent is staked through a use of a pin over here, and then the shifter rod just flips back and forth in between those. As you can see, there's some side-to-side movement, but it's needing to be finished up as far as the restoration of this piece yet, but it'll get done soon enough. Okay, anybody have any other questions? If that's it, it should be lunchtime, it's noon. We can all retire over to the lunchroom. Thank you.